Hi, I'm Ray from Ray's Rants. I just thought I'd tell you what my podcast episodes are roughly about. They're about the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, what it was like back then. I was at school in the 50s and 60s. How different things were in those days. I got the cane at school. Can you imagine that happening these days? The teacher would be taken to court and locked up. School days were very different back then. So were the pubs, the nightclubs, the music, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix. Fantastic. I tell you what, some of the things that I tell the older people, they say, oh yes, I remember this, I remember that. Whereas the youngsters, they don't believe it. How about this? I remember being in the art lesson at school. We did art. I don't know why none of us wanted to do it. The teacher, at his desk in the front of the class, he had a transistor radio on his desk, listening to Radio Caroline and Radio London, the pirate ships. Now you think that's bad or good. He was also smoking. He had his ashtray, his cigarette, his lighter, and he was smoking. The classroom was full of smoke. When I tell the grandchildren that, they say, no, come on, that's not true. It is, it's true. I remember my mum taking me to the doctor's when I was, 8 years old, something like that. I probably had a cold or a sore throat. Tap on his door, and then he'd say, come, you go in. He didn't even look up. And he was smoking. How about that? The doctor sitting at his desk. He wouldn't even look up. The room's full of smoke. And he's got his ashtray, his cigarettes, his lighter. Of course, back then, most people smoked. I remember when I first went to work as an apprentice in the radio and television workshop, everyone smoked. Someone said to me, oh, have a cigarette. And I did. By mid-morning, I'd had a couple of, 2 or 3 cigarettes. I went over to the sweet shop and bought a packet and a box of matches because everyone smoked. They're offering me cigarettes. It was just the done thing. There were 1 or 2 people that didn't smoke, and they were looked upon as a bit weird. They're strange. You don't smoke. That's a bit odd. Whereas these days it's the other way round, isn't it? It's a bit odd if you do smoke because no one does. So isn't it funny how things have turned around? Holidays back then, days out. There were no theme parks. I mean, look at the theme parks we've got now. Nothing like that at all. There was Butlins, of course. Have you ever watched Heidi High, Maplin's holiday camp? I think that's loosely based on Butlins. But you could go as a family to Butlins for a week's holiday or a day out even. But apart from that, there weren't theme parks and all this. I think we had Chessington Zoo. There were a few zoos around, but none of the rides and all the stuff they've got these days. Absolutely amazing, the difference between then and now. Take cars and the roads. I mean, cars. My first car that I passed my test in was a 1954 Hillman Minx. No, it wasn't in 1954. I'm not that old. But the roads then, they were empty. You could park anywhere. The roads were empty. It was fantastic. Look at the roads now, jam-packed. In fact, cars now park on the pavements, don't they? The shops back then, there were no supermarkets, not in the 50s. They started coming in, late was it 60s, 70s? You go to the local shops, there's the greengrocer, the butcher, the wool shop where you could buy wool and knitting needles, knitting patterns. Look at the hobbies back then. There was Meccano, dolls' houses that kids would play with, the toys. Very, very different. No mobile phones, of course. No laptops and computers and all that. Look at the fashion back then. The boys wore flares. The girls wore miniskirts. Parties. Oh, wild parties back in the 60s when I was in my teens. Good grief. I do mention some of those in the podcast episodes, so you might be interested in that. Relationships, marriage. There's so much that I've covered in my podcast episodes. I've well over 100 now I've recorded different episodes. So I've covered, well, not everything, because you can never cover everything. But every week, every Sunday, there's a new podcast episode that comes out. And I try to make them between sort of 3/4 of an hour and an hour long. And I ramble on, I raise rants, I rant on about the good old days. When I was a boy, we were always over the woods. After school, weekends, summer holidays, we were always over the woods, climbing trees, going over to the ponds and lakes that were nearby in the countryside, looking at the newts, sticklebacks, frogs, tadpoles, great fun, all the wildlife around. Of course, it's all housing estates now. All the woods I played in as a kid, it's all housing estates now. Such a shame. It's all concrete. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the podcast episodes. Have a listen to them. As I say, there's well over 100. Email me, rants, that's all one word, rants@protonmail.com. Be great to hear from you. rants@protonmail.com. Whether you've got any suggestions or ideas or any comments, rude or otherwise, I don't care. Be great to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoy the episodes. Take care. Bye-bye for now.